What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and in this video we're going to move to the Big Ten in our overrated, underrated video, where we're looking at how teams performed in one-possession games. And it's not necessarily just to figure out which teams are overrated or underrated. It's just to see kind of what could have been for these teams. What if they had won all of their one-possession games? What if they had lost them? What was kind of the best and worst case scenario that could have happened last season? And yes, I do think you can take some away from this towards whether a team is overrated or underrated based off at least their final record at the end of the season. We did the SEC yesterday, moving on to the Big Ten, and I think you could definitely take some things away from the Big Ten, and we'll show you here in just a second. Let's go to the Big Ten East, and let's look back at 2020 and see if there was anything we could have taken away that played out, and not really. I mean, you could maybe say Penn State was underrated because they were 0-2 in one-possession games, but for the most part, these teams in the Big Ten East all were close to splitting their one-possession games. So that would be the only takeaway, that maybe Penn State was better than their record, and maybe that's a better way of putting this, not necessarily overrated and underrated, but which teams are better or worse than their final record. And for Penn State, they were better than their final record. I think that showed they improved this year and had a chance to be much better, but they really struggled in one-possession games once again. And I will show you what I'm talking about here. Let's go to the Big Ten East. Here are the standings. Of course, Michigan, and I say standings, these are just the final records. These are not based off of conference games, but here are the records from 2021. Of course, Michigan at 11-1, Ohio State, Michigan State at 10-2. Penn State 7-5, Maryland 6-6, Rutgers 5-7, and there's Indiana at 2-10. Were they the most disappointing team of the year of the country last season? I mean, what a surprise with Indiana. Really thought they were going to be much better. I thought they were the one team that might could challenge Ohio State in the East. Obviously, that did not play out, as Michigan was the team that won the East. But how were these teams in one-possession games? Well, for Michigan, they were 3-1. So there were three opportunities where they could have lost, but they won. And that record in one-possession games is what ultimately got Michigan to the Big Ten Championship. Ohio State was 0-1. They didn't play in many one-possession games. They either blew out their opponents, or in the case of the game against Michigan, they lost that game by multiple possessions. Michigan State was 4-0 in one-possession games. And I don't want to take anything away from Michigan State. What they did this year was very impressive. Mel Tucker is doing a fantastic job. But to jump Michigan State from preseason expectations where they may not even make a bowl game to putting them in a playoff picture, I think that was a little bit premature. And you see, they really were fortunate in these close games. And if you lose a couple of those games, if you split those games, it's a totally different season for Michigan State. Again, I don't want to take anything away. This was a very good team. They absolutely earned everything they got, but to put them in that conversation with the elite teams in college football because they went 10-2, I think is not necessarily very accurate. For Penn State, they were 2-4 in one-possession games. So again, they struggled in the close games. That means the last 2 years, Penn State 2-6 in one-possession games, and this only counts regular season games. We're not looking at bowl games or anything like that because I don't like taking any data from bowl games because you have players sitting out. Motivation is questionable sometimes for teams, so I don't really like looking at that. So we're just looking at the regular season here. Maryland was 3-0. Maryland did really well in their one-possession games, just like Michigan State. Rutgers was 1-1, and Indiana was 1-2. So if these teams won all of their one-possession games, what would the records have been? Well, Michigan would have been 12-0, only one loss in it. They only had one loss all year, and that was a one-possession game to Michigan State, of course, and a game that they probably should have won, really. Ohio State would have been 11-1. Michigan State still would have been 10-2. So that was really their best-case scenario this past season. They weren't going to get above 10-2. That was their ceiling. Penn State had a higher ceiling. They could have went 11-1 if they had won all of their one-possession games. Maryland still would have been 6-6. Rutgers could have gotten to a bowl game at 6-6, although they did go to a bowl game, even though they didn't get to 500. And then Indiana would have been 4-8, a little bit better, but still, it would have been a rough season for the Hoosiers. How about if they lost all of their one-possession games? Look at that. Michigan would have been 8-4. So we're talking about a team that went to the college football playoff that could have easily been 8-4 this past season. maybe Michigan was overrated just a little bit, and maybe that's why they struggled against Georgia. Ohio State 10-2. If they had lost all of theirs, they did lose all theirs, so that wouldn't have changed anything. But look at Michigan State. They could have been 6-6. So yeah, Michigan and Michigan State surprised everyone this year. Both teams, I think, better than everyone expected them to be. But you see how easily it could have gone a different direction, and these two teams would have been about where everyone expected them to be. But they took care of business. They won those one-possession games, which is obviously very important. And if they're going to stay at the top of the Big Ten East, they'll probably have to win a lot of close games next year. Penn State could have been 5-7, could have missed out on a bowl game. Maryland could have been 3-9, even worse than Rutgers, who would have been 4-8. Indiana at 1-11, could have been 1-11. So if they split all their one-possession games, how would it have looked? What would the records have been? Well, Michigan would have been 10-2, but Ohio State, according to this formula, actually was the best team in the Big Ten East. Now, they would have went 10.5 and 1.5. Obviously, you can't have a half a game, but that's what the numbers would average out to. Michigan State and Penn State pretty even at 8-4. That's a big difference from 10-2 to 7-5. That's a pretty big gap. But if you split the one-possession games, these two teams were even, both 8-4, which is very interesting. Maryland 4.5 and 7.5. Rutgers still 5-7, and Indiana would have picked up a half a game. Would have been 2.5 and 9.5. So our takeaways from the East, I think it's pretty obvious. Michigan and Michigan State were fortunate, and I say fortunate. They earned their way towards the top because they won these one-possession games. But we all know in a one-score game, one little thing can change everything. A penalty, a turnover, a missed call, so many things can change a game. Look at the Michigan State game. Still debate about the fumble play. So it could have been a much different season for both Michigan and Michigan State. And for Penn State, if they would have taken care of business in some of their close games, maybe they would have been, who knows, second in the Big Ten East or third, or at least could have gotten to 8 or 9 wins. But those one-score games definitely made a difference for Michigan, Michigan State, and Penn State in the Big Ten East. Let's go to the Big Ten West now. These were the 2020 records. You see, not a whole lot to take away from this. Maybe Northwestern was overrated a little bit, 2-0 in one-possession games, and they did drop off a lot this year. But I don't. This was just a different team. They just lost so much. That's why they dropped off, not because they were overrated in 2020. Let's go to 2021. And there's Iowa at the top, then Minnesota, Wisconsin, Purdue, Illinois, Nebraska, and Northwestern. And everyone, as soon as I put out the SEC video, I had so many comments. I can't wait to see what Nebraska's numbers look like. Just wait till you get to Nebraska. I hope that's going to be crazy. And you guys know the numbers. I'm going to show them to you, though, here. In the one-possession games, we'll start with Iowa. Just like Michigan State, Iowa very fortunate to win some close games. They were 4-0 in one-score games. Minnesota was 3-3. They played 6 one-score games. Wisconsin 2-1, Purdue 2-1, Illinois 3-4. There is Nebraska, 0-8 in one-possession games. 0-8. I've never seen anything like this. And again, that would tell us that maybe Nebraska was, and everyone would agree with this, they were better than their record. They were better than they were the best 3-9 team in the country. They were probably better than any 5-7 team. I'll go that far. This was a good team. This was a pretty good team that should have probably at least gotten to 6-6 this past season, but they just couldn't win those close games. Northwestern, after going 2-0 in 2020, was 0-2 in 2021, so they flipped the script there. How about if these teams had won all of their one-score games? Iowa still would have been 10-2. That was the ceiling for the Hawkeyes. Minnesota had the highest ceiling in the Big Ten West. They could have gotten to 11-1. Their only loss by more than one score was Ohio State. That was their only loss that was not a one-possession game. Minnesota perhaps could have really made some noise in the Big Ten West if they would have won their close games. Wisconsin and Purdue, their numbers are identical here. They both could have gotten to 9-3, but that was about it. And then there's Illinois. They also could have gotten to 9-3 after losing 4 one-score games. And then Nebraska, 11-1. They are tied for Minnesota with the highest ceiling in the Big Ten West, even though they were 3-9. Just unbelievable numbers here. Northwestern could have gotten to 5-7, but even if they had won their one-score games, Northwestern would not have made it to a bowl game. How about if these teams had lost their one-possession games? Iowa would have been 6-6, a totally different year. Minnesota would have been 5-7. Wisconsin and Purdue would have been 6-6. Illinois could have been 2-10. That would have changed for Nebraska. They still would have been 3-9. And same thing for Northwestern. They would have been 3-9. So what happens if we split the one-score games? How do the records look? Well, Iowa would have just been 8-4. Minnesota would have been 8-4. These two teams would have tied for the best record in the Big Ten West at 8-4. Wisconsin and Purdue would have been 7.5 and 4.5. Illinois there at 5.5 and 6.5. Nebraska would have been 7-5. So you just split your one-score games. Nebraska goes from 3-9 all the way up to 7-5, and they're at a bowl game. And Northwestern would have been 4-8. So yeah, the Big Ten West, it's very clear who was underrated and who was overrated, or at least who was better than their record and who was worse than their record. Iowa was clearly not as good as their 10-2 record, and I think a lot of things down the stretch would say that is very accurate. They early on had a lot of turnovers. Defense made a lot of big plays. They won some big games, but consistently throughout the season, Iowa was not a top 10 team. And yes, they were 10-2, but their record really should have been closer to 8-4, at least 9-3. And then for Nebraska, this should have been a bowl team. 3-9 is just crazy when you had 8 one-score games. You lose every single one of them. So that's definitely the biggest takeaway in the Big Ten West, Iowa and Nebraska. So if you're looking ahead to next year in the Big Ten, could we see Penn State make a jump up? Michigan and Michigan State maybe fall off a little bit. Nebraska make a jump up. Iowa maybe fall off a little bit. We'll revisit after the 2022 season and see if it does play out that way. I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that's what the numbers would suggest could possibly be going to happen heading into next year. What are your thoughts on this? Give me your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think that these numbers are going to tell us anything about 2022, or do you think these numbers are really meaningless? They're interesting to look at, I know that. And if nothing else, it's interesting to see how their seasons could have been much better or much worse based off of these one-score games.